My SEL kept smacking me at the back of my head and calls it a love tap. Until someone caught her on camera. My sister-in-law Denise had this thing where she'd smack the back of my head every single time she saw me, and everyone acted like it was the funniest, most endearing quirk instead of straight-up assault. It started at my wedding to her brother Tom when I was signing the guest book, and she walked up behind me and whacked me hard enough to make me drop the pen. She laughed and said, "Welcome to the family, we're very hands-on." Everyone chuckled like it was adorable hazing instead of her hitting me at my own wedding. After that, it became her signature move. Every family dinner, she'd walk past my chair and smack my head while I was eating. Every birthday party, barbecue, holiday gathering, funeral, even at my father's wake, she'd find a moment to hit me when I wasn't looking. Sometimes it was hard enough to give me headaches. Sometimes she'd do it multiple times in one event. She'd always laugh and say, "It's how I show affection, get used to it." Tom thought it was hilarious and said Denise only teases people she likes. His parents said she'd always been playful and I needed to loosen up. Other relatives said it was harmless fun and I was being too sensitive about a little tap. But these weren't little taps, they were full-force hits that left my scalp stinging and my neck sore. I'd have migraines for days after family events just from anticipating when she'd strike next. I tried everything to make it stop. I asked her politely to please not hit me anymore, and she said, "Don't be such a baby, it's just how I communicate." I tried avoiding her, but she'd hunt me down specifically to smack me, then act hurt that I was avoiding family. I tried ducking when I saw her coming, and she'd tell everyone I was being dramatic and making her look bad. I even tried hitting her back once, and the entire family turned on me saying I was aggressive and inappropriate while Denise was just being affectionate. Tom told me I needed to apologize for overreacting, and I ended up having to say sorry for defending myself against his sister's constant attacks. She'd time it for when I was holding hot drinks so I'd spill on myself. She'd do it right before I had to speak at events so I'd be flustered and distracted. She'd even started teaching her kids that smacking Aunt Lucy was a fun game and they should do it too. I was being physically abused by an entire family who thought it was comedy. After 3 years of this, I was at my breaking point. I had chronic neck pain from constantly tensing up around her. I'd stopped going to family events and Tom was getting angry about me isolating myself from his family. I was taking prescription painkillers for the headaches and spending hundreds on chiropractor visits. Denise had literally given me a neurological condition from repeated head trauma, but everyone still acted like I was overreacting to playful affection. The explosion happened at Tom's parents' 40th anniversary party. It was a huge event with probably 70 people, including extended family and their friends. I'd taken preventive pain medication and was trying to stay in crowded areas where Denise couldn't easily reach me, but she was determined to get her hit in. She followed me to the bathroom and waited outside. When I came out, she smacked me so hard I saw stars and stumbled forward into the wall. I heard something pop in my neck and pain shot down my entire left side. That's when Tom's cousin Bradley turned the corner and saw me on the ground holding my neck with Denise standing over me laughing. Bradley helped me up and asked what happened. Denise said, "Oh, Lucy's being her usual dramatic self, pretending I hurt her with a love tap." Bradley looked at her strange and said, "I just watched you hit her full force in the head. That wasn't a love tap, that was battery." Denise tried to laugh it off, but Bradley wasn't having it. He said, "Actually, I've been watching you do this all night. You've hit her 4 times already, and it's only been an hour. That's not affection, that's abuse." Denise said Bradley was overreacting too, but then Bradley said something that changed everything. "You know what's interesting, Denise? You only hit Lucy. I've been paying attention for the last year, and you don't playfully smack anyone else. Not Tom, not your parents, not your kids, not your friends. Just Lucy. That's not a quirky personality trait, that's targeted harassment." People started gathering around because Bradley's voice was getting louder. Tom came over asking what was wrong, and Bradley said, "Your sister has been physically assaulting your wife for years, and you've all been laughing about it. I just witnessed her hit Lucy hard enough to injure her neck, and she's standing here smiling about it." Tom tried to defend Denise, saying it was just how she showed affection, but Bradley pulled out his phone. "Actually, I've been recording her doing it all night for evidence. Want to see the compilation?" Bradley held up his phone and turned the screen toward the crowd. The hallway went dead quiet as people leaned in to watch. The video showed me sitting at a table eating and Denise walking up behind me and smacking the back of my head hard enough that my fork dropped. Then it cut to me talking to someone and Denise hitting me again from behind. Then me getting a drink and another hit. Then me near the bathroom and the final strike that put me on the ground. 4 hits in 1 hour, all caught on camera with timestamps. You could see my head snap forward each time and the force was obvious. These weren't taps or pats, they were full swings like someone hitting a volleyball. Denise's face went from that smug smile to completely white as more people crowded around Bradley's phone. She started talking fast, saying the video didn't show everything, and that Bradley must have edited it somehow to make her look violent. But people were shaking their heads and whispering to each other. I saw Tom's aunt cover her mouth. His uncle took a step back from Denise. A couple of cousins were staring at her like they'd never seen her before. Someone said they couldn't believe what they were watching. Tom pushed through to see the screen, and I watched his face as he saw his sister hitting me over and over. His expression went confused, like he couldn't match what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. He kept saying it looked worse on video than it was in real life, that the angle made it seem more violent than it actually felt. Bradley cut him off and said it looked exactly as bad as it was because that's what assault looks like. Tom tried to argue, but Bradley played the video again and asked Tom to watch his wife's head snap forward and tell him that was playful. Tom's mouth opened, but nothing came out. That's when Josephine came rushing over asking what all the noise was about. Bradley held up his phone without saying anything and let her watch. She stood there completely still as the video played through all 4 hits. When it finished, she was quiet for a long moment before saying she had no idea Denise was hitting me that hard. Her voice was small and shocked. Wallace appeared behind her and immediately started making excuses about camera angles and how phones distort things and make everything look more dramatic than it is. But several relatives were shaking their heads in disagreement. Someone said the video showed exactly what happened and there was no distortion. Another person said they'd seen Denise hit me earlier in the night and thought it was weird but didn't want to say anything. I was still on the floor holding my neck and the pain shooting down my left side was getting worse by the second. Every breath hurt. Moving my head even slightly sent sharp stabbing pains through my neck and shoulder. Sabine pushed through the crowd and knelt beside me asking if I needed to go to the emergency room. I tried to nod, but the movement made me gasp. She helped me stand up slowly while supporting most of my weight. The hallway tilted and I had to close my eyes until the dizziness passed. Tom reached for me, but I pulled away from him hard enough that I almost fell again. The hurt look on his face would normally make me feel guilty and want to apologize, but I was too angry. 3 years of him telling me I was being dramatic and too sensitive and that Denise was just being affectionate. 3 years of him choosing his sister over me every single time. Bradley stepped between us and told Tom to back off. Then Bradley offered to drive me to the hospital while Tom just stood there looking lost and confused like he didn't know what to do. I accepted Bradley's help without even looking at my husband. We walked past the crowd and I heard people talking in low voices behind us. Someone asked if we should call an ambulance, but Bradley said his car would be faster. The drive to the emergency room took 15 minutes, and Bradley kept asking if I was okay, while I sat in the passenger seat trying not to move my neck at all. The emergency room was busy and bright and too loud. Bradley helped me check in and explained what happened to the nurse at the desk. She took one look at my neck brace from Bradley's car and got me into a room pretty fast. The doctor came in and started examining my neck, asking me to rate my pain and describe what happened. I explained about Denise hitting me at the party and how this had been going on for 3 years. The doctor's hands were gentle as she felt along my spine and neck, but even light pressure made me want to scream. She ordered x-rays and an MRI right away to check for serious damage. When she asked how this injury happened, I told her about the assault and the 3 years of repeated head hits. She got very quiet and wrote something in her notes. Then she said she was required to document this as domestic violence. The words hit me hard because I'd never thought of it that way, but she was right. This was violence happening in my family, and everyone had been acting like it was normal. The x-ray tech was careful moving me onto the table and the machine hummed and clicked around my head. Then they took me for the MRI, which was worse because I had to lie completely still in a loud tube while my neck screamed. After all the tests, the doctor came back with results. She said I had acute cervical strain and aggravation of chronic neck injury. The MRI showed inflammation and some damage to the soft tissue that would need time and physical therapy to heal. She recommended I see a neurologist soon to evaluate cumulative head trauma effects because repeated hits like that could cause lasting problems. She gave me stronger pain medication than I'd been taking and fitted me with a proper neck brace that would keep my head stable. Then she handed me a bunch of papers about domestic violence resources and support groups. She looked me in the eye and said what was happening to me wasn't normal family behavior, and I didn't have to accept it. I took the papers and tried not to cry, because someone was finally saying out loud what I'd known for 3 years. Bradley waited with me through the entire emergency room visit, sitting in the plastic chair and getting me water and helping me fill out forms. When Tom finally showed up 2 hours later, Bradley stood up and told him he should have been here from the start instead of staying at the party to manage his sister's feelings. Tom looked terrible, like he'd been crying, but I was too exhausted and in too much pain to deal with his emotions right now. The medication was making me fuzzy, and all I wanted was to lie down somewhere quiet. Bradley drove me to his apartment instead of taking me home to the house I shared with Tom. He set me up in his guest room with extra pillows to keep my neck elevated and brought me water and pain pills. He made sure my phone was charging and asked if I needed anything else. The care and concern he showed me in one night was more than my own husband had given me in 3 years of being assaulted by his sister. I fell asleep in Bradley's guest room wearing borrowed clothes and trying not to think about how my marriage might be over, and how I'd spent 3 years being abused by a whole family who thought it was funny. My phone started buzzing around midnight and didn't stop. Tom called 17 times in a row, and I watched the screen light up over and over from where it sat charging on the nightstand. The neck brace made it hard to turn my head to look at it properly, and each buzz sent a jolt of anxiety through my body. I let every call go to voicemail because I wasn't ready to hear him defend his sister again, or make excuses for why he stayed at the party instead of coming to the hospital right away. Around 1 in the morning, the calls finally stopped and a text came through instead. "We need to talk about what happened tonight. The family is very upset and we need to figure out how to handle this situation." I stared at those words for a long time before typing back a response. Upset about me being assaulted or upset about Denise being exposed? The 3 dots appeared showing he was typing, then disappeared, then appeared again. 3 hours passed with no response, and I finally fell into restless sleep with my phone clutched in my hand. The next morning, I woke up stiff and sore with the neck brace digging into my shoulders. Bradley had already left for work, but he'd set out coffee and breakfast and left a note saying to call if I needed anything. I sat at his kitchen table with my phone and pulled up Tristan's number from my contacts. He answered on the second ring, and I explained what had been happening for the past 3 years. There was a long silence after I finished talking, and then he said he'd suspected something was wrong, because my injury patterns weren't consistent with normal strain or aging. I asked if he could pull my complete treatment records, and he said he'd already started compiling them after seeing a social media post about the party incident. 68 visits over 3 years, he told me. Every single one documented neck and spine issues concentrated in the same areas. He said the records showed injury patterns completely consistent with repeated blunt force trauma to the head and neck region. He'd email me everything within the hour and would testify if needed about the medical evidence. I thanked him and hung up feeling validated and sick at the same time, because seeing it quantified like that made it impossible to deny how bad this had really been. I spent the rest of the morning on my laptop researching personal injury attorneys who handled assault cases. Bradley's video was saved on my phone, and I had the emergency room records, and now Tristan's documentation spanning 3 years. I sent consultation requests to 5 different law firms explaining the situation and attaching the medical records. 3 responded within hours saying they were very interested in taking my case. I scheduled phone calls with all of them, and by afternoon I was talking to an attorney named Lucille who specialized in family violence cases. She reviewed everything I sent and said I had grounds for both criminal charges through the district attorney and a civil lawsuit for damages. The video evidence was incredibly strong, she explained, and the medical documentation showing a 3-year pattern of injury made this a clear-cut case of sustained assault and battery. But she warned me that suing family members often destroyed relationships permanently, and I needed to be prepared for my marriage and all of Tom's family connections to potentially fall apart. I told her I'd think about it, and she said to call back when I was ready to move forward. Tom showed up at Bradley's apartment that afternoon, banging on the door hard enough to make me jump. I looked through the peephole and saw him standing there looking tired and angry. Part of me wanted to ignore him, but we needed to have this conversation eventually, so I opened the door. He pushed past me into the apartment and immediately started talking. "Denise never meant to actually hurt you," he said. "She's devastated that you got injured, and the whole family is upset about how this got blown out of proportion." I felt anger rise up in my throat, hot and sharp. I asked him to sit down and watch Bradley's video again on my phone. He tried to refuse, but I insisted, and made him watch all 4 hits in the span of 1 hour. "Tell me how those deliberate strikes to someone's head could be anything other than intentional violence," I said. He kept trying to explain that Denise just didn't understand her own strength, or that she thought we had a playful relationship. I pointed out that she never hit anyone else in the family with her so-called playful affection. Just me. Only ever me. For 3 solid years. We had our first real fight about his sister right there in Bradley's living room. Tom kept saying I was making this bigger than it needed to be, and that pressing charges would destroy his family. His voice got louder as he talked about how his parents were heartbroken, and his siblings were taking sides, and Denise was having panic attacks about potentially being arrested. I let him talk himself out, and then I told him his sister had already destroyed his family by assaulting me for 3 years, while everyone laughed. I said the family chose to protect an abuser instead of a victim, and that pattern needed to end now. He needed to decide whose side he was actually on, because he couldn't keep trying to make everyone happy when his sister had committed sustained violence against his wife. Tom said I was being unreasonable and making him choose between his wife and his family. I told him he'd already chosen his family over me every single time I complained about being hit, and he was still choosing them now by asking me to let this go. He said I was twisting everything and making him the bad guy when he was just trying to keep the peace. I said keeping the peace had cost me 3 years of chronic pain and a neurological condition, and I was done sacrificing my safety for his family's comfort. Tom left angry, slamming the door behind him hard enough to rattle the frame. I stood in the middle of Bradley's living room shaking and trying not to cry, because I realized our marriage might not survive this. He still didn't fully understand that protecting his sister meant abandoning his wife. He still thought there was some middle ground where everyone could be happy and move past this without real consequences. The reality was sinking in that I might have to choose between staying married and getting justice for what had been done to me. Bradley came home from work a few hours later and found me crying on his couch. He sat down next to me and said Tom had always been blind to Denise's problems because their parents trained everyone to accommodate her behavior. She'd been the baby of the family and could do no wrong, and anyone who complained about her was accused of being mean or jealous. Bradley said he'd watched this pattern his whole life, and it was why he started recording at the party, because he knew no one would believe how bad it was without proof. Josephine called the next morning asking me to come talk to her privately. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near Bradley's place because I wasn't ready to go to their house. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen her. She stood up when I walked over and tried to hug me, but I stepped back. The neck brace was still on, and I couldn't handle physical contact right now. We sat down, and she started apologizing for not taking my complaints seriously over the years. She said she thought I was exaggerating because Denise had never acted violent before, and she seemed like such a loving person with her own kids. But seeing Bradley's video made her realize she had failed to protect me from her own daughter. She admitted she'd been so focused on keeping family peace that she dismissed real harm being done. Tears were running down her face as she talked, and I could see genuine remorse there. But I also saw fear. Fear that this was going to tear her family apart, and that she was going to lose her relationship with her son, and maybe other family members too. I told Josephine I appreciated her apology and I could see she meant it, but I also told her I was consulting with attorneys about taking legal action against Denise. Her face fell and she reached across the table grabbing my hand. "Please don't press charges," she said. "It would devastate Denise. She could lose her job. She could go to jail. The kids would be traumatized." I pulled my hand back and explained that I had been devastated for 3 years, while everyone prioritized Denise's feelings over my physical safety. That pattern needed to end now. I told her about the 68 chiropractor visits, and the chronic migraines and the pain medication, and the thousands of dollars in medical expenses. I told her about how I stopped going to family events because I was scared of being hit, and how Tom got angry at me for isolating myself instead of protecting me from his sister. Josephine kept crying and saying she understood but begging me not to destroy Denise's life. I said Denise had already destroyed parts of my life and my health, and I needed to see real consequences and accountability, not just apologies. We left the coffee shop without resolving anything, and I could tell this was going to get much worse before it got better. The neurologist appointment was 2 days later at a specialist office across town. Bradley drove me because I was still on pain medication that made me fuzzy. The doctor did a bunch of tests checking my balance and coordination and asking questions about my symptoms. I told her about the chronic migraines and difficulty concentrating and sensitivity to light and noise. She did some kind of cognitive assessment that showed I was having trouble with certain memory tasks and processing speed. After an hour of testing, she sat me down and said I had post-concussive syndrome from repeated head impacts. This explained all my symptoms, and the scary part was that these chronic issues might never fully go away. She looked horrified when I explained the cause was 3 years of my sister-in-law hitting me in the head at family gatherings. She said I was lucky I didn't have permanent brain damage, though the post-concussive syndrome could be considered permanent if the symptoms lasted more than a few months. She gave me information about treatment options and support groups, and said I needed to avoid any further head impacts, because another injury could cause serious lasting damage. The medical bill arrived in the mail 3 days after the neurologist appointment. I opened it sitting at Bradley's kitchen table and felt sick looking at the numbers. Emergency room visit, MRI scan, neurologist consultation, all the tests and assessments. Over $4,000 even with my insurance coverage. This didn't include the hundreds I'd already spent on chiropractor visits over 3 years. It didn't include the prescription pain medication I'd been taking monthly. It didn't include the lost work time from migraines or the cost of the neck brace or any of the other expenses that had piled up. I started adding it up roughly in my head, and realized Denise's abuse had cost me somewhere between $6,000 and $8,000 in direct medical expenses. That wasn't counting the emotional cost or the damage to my marriage or the 3 years of living in fear. I took a picture of the bill and sent it to Lucille with a message saying I was ready to move forward with the lawsuit. Lucille texted back within 5 minutes asking when I could come to her office to go over everything in detail. I scheduled an appointment for the next morning and spent the rest of the day organizing all my medical records into a folder. Bradley helped me print out copies of everything from the emergency room visit to the neurologist report to 3 years of chiropractor bills. We made a timeline of every incident I could remember with dates and witnesses. By the time we finished, it was almost midnight, and I had a stack of papers 2 inches thick documenting Denise's abuse. The next morning, I drove to Lucille's office in a glass building downtown. She had me sit across from her desk while she reviewed every single page of documentation. She watched Bradley's video 3 times, taking notes. After an hour, she looked up and said, I had one of the strongest assault and battery cases she'd seen in years. The video evidence was clear and undeniable. The medical documentation showed a pattern of injuries over 3 years, plus acute trauma from the most recent attack. The witness statements from Bradley and the other party guests backed up my account. She explained I had 2 main options for legal action. I could pursue criminal charges by working with the district attorney's office, which might result in Denise being arrested and prosecuted for assault. Or I could file a civil lawsuit seeking money for my medical costs, pain and suffering, and emotional distress. Criminal charges would be handled by the state and wouldn't cost me anything, but I'd have less control over the outcome. A civil lawsuit would require paying attorney fees, but would give me more control and the chance to recover actual damages. She said I could also do both at the same time if I wanted maximum accountability. The criminal case would focus on punishment while the civil case would focus on compensation. I sat there staring at the papers spread across her desk, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of these decisions. Part of me just wanted Denise to stop hitting me and admit what she'd done was wrong. I didn't necessarily want to see her arrested or sued into bankruptcy. I wanted acknowledgement that I'd been hurt, and that it mattered. I wanted her to understand the 3 years of pain and fear she'd caused. Lucille must have seen the confusion on my face because she leaned forward and said something that changed my perspective. She told me that in her 20 years of practicing law, she'd seen hundreds of abuse cases. The ones where abusers faced real legal consequences were the only ones where the behavior actually stopped. Without serious repercussions, abusers almost always continued their patterns because they'd learned they could get away with it. She said Denise had shown no genuine remorse so far. She hadn't apologized or taken responsibility. She'd only gotten angry about being caught on video. That wasn't someone who understood the harm they'd caused. That was someone who was mad about facing consequences. Lucille said if I really wanted the abuse to stop and wanted Denise to take it seriously, then I needed to pursue legal action. Otherwise, Denise would just wait for things to calm down and eventually start the same behavior again, maybe with me, or maybe with someone else in the family. 3 days later, Tom and I sat in Leopold's office for our first therapy session. The room had comfortable chairs and soft lighting that was supposed to feel calming, but I was too tense to relax. Leopold was an older man with gray hair and a gentle voice who specialized in family conflict. Tom had found him through his insurance and begged me to try counseling before making any final decisions about the marriage. I agreed mostly because I wanted to see if Tom could actually change, or if he was going to keep defending his sister forever. Leopold started by asking each of us to explain our perspective on what happened. I went through the whole story from the wedding day to the anniversary party. Tom sat there looking at his hands while I talked. When it was his turn, Tom said he'd been minimizing my pain for 3 years because he didn't want to believe his sister was capable of real abuse. He said acknowledging how bad it actually was would mean accepting that Denise had serious problems and that his whole family had enabled her behavior. It would mean his parents had failed to protect me. It would mean the family he thought was loving and supportive had actually been toxic. He said it was easier to believe I was being too sensitive than to face the truth about his family. Leopold listened to both of us without interrupting. Then he asked Tom a question that made the whole room go silent. He said if a stranger had walked up to me at a party and hit me 4 times in one night hard enough to injure my neck, what would Tom do? Tom answered immediately, saying he'd call the police and press charges without hesitation. He'd probably try to fight the guy himself. Leopold nodded and said, "So why is it different when Denise did exactly that?" Tom opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. His face went through several expressions as he processed what Leopold had just pointed out. The same behavior that would make him call the cops on a stranger was something he'd been defending for 3 years because it came from his sister. Leopold let the silence stretch out while Tom sat there looking like his whole worldview was cracking apart. Finally, Tom said very quietly that he'd been wrong. He'd been completely wrong to ask me to tolerate abuse just because it came from family. He said he understood now why I couldn't just forgive and forget like his parents wanted. This wasn't about holding grudges or being dramatic. This was about my basic safety and dignity as a person. While Tom and I were trying to fix our marriage, Denise was busy calling every family member she could reach with her version of events. I found out about this from Tom's brother, who called to ask if what Denise was saying was true. According to Denise, I'd always been dramatic and attention-seeking from the day I married into the family. She said I made everything about me and couldn't take a joke. She claimed Bradley had manipulated the video somehow to make her playful taps look violent. She said the family had always walked on eggshells around me because I was so sensitive, and now I was using one accident to destroy her reputation. Some relatives who weren't at the party and hadn't seen the video believed her story. They called Tom asking why he was letting me attack his sister. Wallace was one of Denise's biggest defenders, telling everyone that I was tearing the family apart over a harmless mistake. He said Denise had always been playful and affectionate, and I was twisting her personality into something ugly. He told Tom he was disappointed that his son would side with an outsider over his own blood. Other family members were more cautious, saying they needed to see the video themselves before picking sides. But Denise's campaign was working. She was building a narrative where she was the victim of my jealousy and vindictiveness. 2 days after that smear campaign started, Sabine called me. She's Tom's aunt on his mother's side, and I'd always liked her, but we weren't particularly close. She asked if we could talk privately, and I said sure, wondering if she was calling to defend Denise too. But instead, Sabine said she needed to tell me something she should have said years ago. She'd been watching Denise's behavior at family events for the past 3 years. She'd noticed that Denise only hit me, never anyone else. Not Tom or her own kids or her parents or friends, just me. Every single time. Sabine said she recognized it as targeted behavior, but she didn't say anything because she didn't want to cause family drama. She thought maybe if she stayed quiet, it would eventually stop on its own. Now she felt terrible for her silence while I suffered. She said she should have spoken up the first time she saw it happen. She should have pulled Denise aside or told Tom's parents or done something instead of being a bystander. She apologized for failing me and said she'd be willing to provide a statement about what she'd witnessed if I needed it for legal purposes. I thanked her and tried not to cry because having someone from Tom's family actually validate my experience meant more than I could explain. It wasn't just Bradley anymore. Sabine had seen it too and recognized it as wrong. Bradley decided to send his video to more family members, including Tom's siblings who lived out of state and hadn't been at the anniversary party. He sent it with a message explaining what he'd witnessed and asking people to watch the full compilation before making judgments. The responses were all over the place. Tom's brother, who lived in California, watched it and immediately called to apologize for not believing me sooner. He said the video made it clear this wasn't playful teasing. He cut off contact with Denise, saying he couldn't support someone who'd abuse a family member like that. Tom's sister, who lived in Texas, had a different reaction. She called Bradley furious that he'd recorded private family moments and spread them around. She said he'd betrayed family loyalty by documenting Denise without her knowledge. She thought we should have handled this privately through family discussions, not by collecting evidence like Denise was a criminal. Several cousins fell somewhere in between, saying they were shocked by what they saw, but uncomfortable with how public everything was becoming. A few relatives accused Bradley of stirring up trouble and making things worse by sharing the video. They said he should have just talked to Denise privately instead of embarrassing her in front of everyone. That's when Denise made her move on social media. She posted a long message on her personal accounts about being unfairly attacked by jealous family members who wanted to destroy her reputation. She didn't name me specifically, but anyone who knew the situation would know exactly who she meant. She wrote about how some people can't handle others being happy and successful. She said certain relatives had always resented her close relationship with her family and were now making up lies to turn everyone against her. She talked about being a devoted mother and sister who always tried to show love and affection. She said she was punished for having a playful personality that some people chose to misinterpret. The post got dozens of comments from her friends and people who didn't know the full story. They told her to stay strong and not let haters bring her down. They said real family would support her through this. They called me and Bradley toxic people without naming us directly. I watched this happen in real time as Denise built a counter-narrative where she was the victim. She was creating a public record of her version before most people had even heard mine. I realized she was way ahead of me in the court of public opinion. I needed official documentation of what happened regardless of whether I pursued criminal charges. Bradley drove me to the police station on a Tuesday morning. The officer who took my report was a woman probably in her 40s, who listened carefully while I explained everything. I showed her the medical records and Bradley's video. She watched the whole compilation without saying anything, but her expression got harder as it went on. When it finished, she said she'd seen a lot of domestic violence cases, and this was clearly assault and battery. She took detailed notes about every incident I could remember. She documented my injuries and medical treatment. She explained that she'd file the report and forward it to the district attorney's office for review. The DA would decide whether to pursue criminal charges based on the evidence. She said with video documentation and medical records this strong they'd probably want to prosecute. She gave me a case number and told me someone from the DA's office would contact me within a week. She also gave me information about victim services and restraining orders if I needed them. Walking out of that police station with an official report felt surreal. This was really happening. Denise might actually face criminal charges for what she'd done to me. That evening, Tom finally told his parents he supported me pursuing legal action if that's what I needed to feel safe. We were at their house for dinner along with Denise and her husband. Tom had been avoiding the conversation for days, but Leopold said he needed to take a clear stand with his family. So right there at the dinner table, Tom said he believed me. He said he'd watched the video multiple times, and there was no way to interpret Denise's actions as anything other than assault. He said I had every right to press charges and file a lawsuit. He said he supported whatever decision I made because his job as my husband was to protect me, not to protect his sister from consequences of her own behavior. Wallace's face turned red and he slammed his hand on the table. He said Tom was betraying his own sister over a woman he'd only known a few years. He said blood was supposed to be thicker than water, and Tom was choosing wrong. He told Tom that if he supported me in destroying Denise's life, then he was no son of his. Josephine sat there quietly with tears running down her face, clearly torn between her children. Denise started crying, saying she couldn't believe her own brother was turning on her. Her husband tried to calm everyone down, but Wallace kept yelling. He said I'd poisoned Tom against his family. He said I was vindictive and manipulative. He said the whole thing was my fault for not being able to take a joke. Tom stood up and said we were leaving. Wallace told him not to come back until he came to his senses. We walked out while Denise sobbed and Josephine tried to hold the family together. Tom cried the whole drive home. That night we sat in our living room and Tom said he wanted me to move back home. He told me he'd set firm boundaries with his family and put our marriage first instead of keeping peace with Denise. He admitted he'd been a terrible husband by forcing me to endure abuse just to avoid family conflict. He said he wanted to rebuild my trust through actions, not just words. I wanted to believe him, but 3 years of him choosing his sister over me made it hard to trust promises. I told him I needed to see real changes before I could move back. He nodded and said he understood. Over the next week, he called his parents and told them we wouldn't attend any events where Denise was present. He blocked Denise's number on his phone. He started going to therapy with Leopold twice a week. After 10 days of watching him actually follow through, I packed my things at Bradley's place and went home. 3 days after I moved back, the district attorney's office called. A prosecutor named Jennifer asked if I wanted to pursue criminal charges for assault and battery. She explained that with Bradley's video evidence and my medical records, they could probably get a conviction. But she warned that as a first offense, Denise would likely get probation instead of jail time, maybe community service and anger management classes. I asked what would happen if I didn't press charges, and she said the case would be closed. I told her I needed time to think about it. She gave me 2 weeks to decide and said to call her office when I was ready. I spent those 2 weeks trying to figure out what I actually wanted. Part of me wanted Denise to face real consequences. Part of me just wanted her to leave me alone. Leopold suggested I attend a support group for people dealing with family violence to help process everything. The group met Tuesday nights at a community center downtown. I walked into a room with folding chairs arranged in a circle and about 12 people sitting quietly. A woman named Sarah ran the group and asked if I wanted to share my story. I explained about Denise and the head smacking and how everyone treated it like a joke for 3 years. When I finished, several people nodded like they understood exactly what I meant. One woman said her brother used to punch her arm hard enough to leave bruises, but their parents said he was just being playful. Another woman shared that her husband's family dismissed his shoving and grabbing as roughhousing until she ended up with a broken wrist. She said her in-laws accused her of being dramatic and trying to get their son in trouble. I recognized the same pattern of making the victim responsible for the abuser's actions. Hearing other people's stories helped me realize how normalized the abuse had become in my life. I'd started believing maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I couldn't take a joke. But sitting in that circle listening to people describe similar experiences made me understand that what happened to me was real abuse no matter how much Tom's family wanted to pretend otherwise. Bradley started coming over to our house several times a week. Most of Tom's family either stopped talking to us completely or acted weird and distant when we ran into them at stores or restaurants. Bradley was the only one who treated me normally and supported me without any conditions. He helped me document every interaction with Denise or people defending her. When Tom's aunt sent a long email about how I was tearing the family apart, Bradley helped me save it and organize it in a folder with dates and details. When Wallace left a voicemail saying I was being vindictive, Bradley made sure I kept the recording. He said having documentation of their harassment would be important if things escalated. His validation helped counter the constant messages from family members insisting I was overreacting. Tom appreciated Bradley's support too, since he was struggling with losing most of his family over this. 2 weeks after the DA called, Denise's husband phoned Tom. He asked if we could drop the legal action and accept an apology from Denise. Tom put the call on speaker so I could hear. Tom asked if Denise had actually apologized yet. There was a long silence before her husband admitted she was still angry about being ambushed at the party. He said she felt attacked and humiliated in front of everyone. Tom told him there was nothing to discuss until Denise took genuine responsibility for 3 years of assault. Her husband tried to argue that Denise didn't mean any harm and we were blowing everything out of proportion. Tom said the video and medical records proved otherwise and hung up. I was proud of him for not backing down. I decided not to pursue criminal charges. Instead, I wanted to file a civil lawsuit for medical expenses and damages. I didn't want to see Denise in jail. I wanted acknowledgement that what she did was wrong, and compensation for the thousands of dollars I'd spent on medical care because of her violence. Lucille filed the paperwork at the courthouse. A process server delivered the lawsuit to Denise at her home on a Thursday afternoon. According to Tom's brother, who still talked to us, Denise screamed at the process server and slammed the door in his face. Then she called her parents crying about how I was suing her. Wallace apparently started yelling about getting their own lawyer and fighting this. Josephine tried to calm everyone down, but the whole family was in chaos. Tom's brother said it was the biggest drama their family had seen in decades. That evening, Wallace called Tom's cell phone. Tom answered and immediately held the phone away from his ear because Wallace was screaming, so loud I could hear every word from across the room. Wallace yelled about how I was destroying the family with my vindictiveness and greed. He said I was trying to bankrupt his daughter over nothing. Tom stayed calm and responded that I was seeking compensation for thousands in medical bills caused by Wallace's daughter's violence. He said if Wallace had taken my complaint seriously 3 years ago, we wouldn't be in this situation now. Wallace called Tom a traitor and said he was choosing a wife over his own blood. Tom said he was choosing to protect his wife from assault, which should have been everyone's priority from the start. Wallace hung up on him. Tom sat on the couch looking exhausted and told me it was painful but necessary to stop enabling his father's denial. Over the next few days, Tom's siblings started reaching out with their reactions to the lawsuit. His brother called to say he completely supported us and was cutting off contact with Denise. He said he'd watched the video multiple times and couldn't believe he'd laughed at some of those incidents before understanding what was really happening. He apologized for not speaking up sooner. Tom's sister called with a different message. She thought we should handle this privately without lawyers and courts. She said airing family problems publicly was embarrassing and unnecessary. Tom asked how we were supposed to handle it privately when the family were ignored my complaints for 3 years. His sister didn't have an answer but kept insisting there had to be a better way than lawsuits. The family was splitting into camps. Some believed the abuse was real and serious. Others thought I was exaggerating for attention or money. Tom's extended family stopped inviting us to gatherings because our presence caused too much conflict. 3 weeks after filing the lawsuit, Lucille called with news. Denise's attorney had sent a settlement offer, $2,000 with no admission of wrongdoing. Lucille said it was insulting given my documented medical expenses alone exceeded $5,000. That didn't even include pain and suffering or the emotional damage from 3 years of constant abuse. I told Lucille I was rejecting the offer. She asked if I was sure because going to trial would be stressful and expensive. I said accepting that settlement would feel like validating everyone who minimized my suffering. It would be like agreeing that 3 years of assault was only worth $2,000. Lucille said she understood and would proceed with trial preparation. She warned it might take 6 months or more to get a court date, but she was confident we'd win a much larger judgment if we went to trial. Tom started having another crisis a few days later. We were eating dinner when he suddenly put down his fork and said he was struggling with the reality that his sister was genuinely abusive. He'd spent his whole life thinking of Denise as fun and energetic and a little wild, but never as someone who would deliberately hurt people. Accepting that she'd assaulted me repeatedly for 3 years meant accepting that his parents had enabled it, and his whole family had failed me. It meant his childhood memories of family harmony were based on everyone ignoring problems, instead of actually being close and loving. Leopold helped him work through the grief of losing his idealized family image during their next therapy session. Tom came home and told me he was done asking me to consider Denise's feelings. He said his focus now was on my healing and rebuilding our marriage. He admitted he'd been more worried about keeping his family together than protecting his wife, and that had to change permanently. The discovery process started 2 weeks later, and Denise's attorney sent over a motion claiming I'd consented to the physical contact by continuing to attend family events where it occurred. Lucille called me sounding almost excited because she said this was the weakest defense she'd seen in years. She scheduled a meeting at her office and spread out 3 years of documentation across her conference table showing every text message I'd sent to Tom asking him to make Denise stop, every email I'd written to Josephine explaining how much the hits hurt, every message I'd sent to other family members begging them to help me. She also had Tom's deposition transcript where he admitted under oath that I'd asked him dozens of times to get his sister to stop hitting me, and he'd refused because he thought I was overreacting. Lucille filed a response that basically destroyed the consent argument by showing I'd objected constantly, and the family had ignored my complaints for 3 years. She said Denise's attorney would probably drop that line of defense entirely after seeing our evidence. A few days later, I got a thick envelope in the mail from an address I didn't recognize. Inside was a letter signed by 3 of Tom's cousins who'd been at the anniversary party and witnessed the bathroom assault. They wrote that they'd seen Denise hit me hard enough to knock me into the wall, and they'd heard the sound my neck made when something popped. They said they'd been talking among themselves since seeing Bradley's video and realized they'd witnessed Denise hitting me at other family events too, but hadn't understood it was serious until they saw me injured on the floor. All 3 offered to testify in court if the case went to trial, and they included their contact information for Lucille. I sat at the kitchen table reading their letter 3 times, because after months of family members telling me I was making a big deal out of nothing, having witnesses validate what happened felt incredible. I called Lucille immediately, and she said having multiple witnesses to the bathroom assault plus Bradley's video made our case even stronger. She asked if I wanted her to contact the 3 cousins to get formal statements, and I said yes because their support made me more determined to see this through to the end. Tom started going to individual therapy with a different counselor than Leopold to work on why he'd prioritized his family's comfort over my safety. He came home from his 3rd session looking exhausted, and told me his therapist had helped him see patterns from childhood where his parents expected him to smooth over any conflict and protect Denise from consequences because she was the baby of the family. Tom said he remembered being 7 years old and getting punished for tattling when he told his parents Denise had hit him, and his mom had said he needed to be the bigger person and let it go. He'd learned early that keeping peace meant ignoring problems and making excuses for his sister's behavior. Understanding where his enabling came from didn't excuse 3 years of dismissing my pain, but it helped explain why changing these patterns was so hard for him. He was working with his therapist on setting boundaries with his parents, and recognizing when he was falling back into old habits of protecting Denise, instead of protecting me. Josephine called my cell phone 3 weeks after the discovery motion, and asked if we could meet with a family mediator to try resolving this without going to trial. I told her I'd consider mediation only if Denise participated and took genuine responsibility, instead of making excuses. Josephine promised Denise would be there and would be serious about finding a resolution. I said I needed to talk to Lucille first, and Josephine agreed to wait for my answer. Lucille said mediation could be good, because it might get us a better settlement than the insulting offer Denise's attorney had made, but she insisted on attending with me to protect my legal interests. We scheduled the mediation for 3 weeks out at a neutral location downtown. In preparation for mediation, I spent several nights writing out every incident I could remember from 3 years of abuse. I started with the wedding when Denise hit me while I was signing the guest book, and worked forward chronologically through every family dinner, holiday gathering, birthday party, and barbecue where she'd struck me. I documented the time she hit me at my father's wake while I was greeting mourners. I wrote about the Christmas when she smacked my head so hard I dropped a plate of food. I listed the birthday party where she taught her kids to hit me as a game. The list grew to 4 pages single-spaced, and when I counted up the incidents, I'd documented approximately 60 separate assaults over 3 years. Seeing it written out like that made me feel sick, because the sheer number of times she'd hit me was horrifying in black and white. I showed Tom the list and he went pale reading it because he'd been present for most of these incidents, and had laughed or told me to relax instead of protecting me. The mediation session happened on a cold Tuesday morning at a conference center downtown. Denise arrived with her husband looking nervous and defensive. Josephine came alone because Wallace had refused to participate, saying the whole thing was ridiculous. Tom and I sat on one side of the long conference table with Lucille, while Denise and her husband sat across from us with their attorney. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who explained the ground rules about respectful communication and working toward resolution. Denise started by saying she was sorry I was hurt, but she insisted she'd never intended any harm and thought we were joking around the whole time. The words made me instantly angry because she was still not taking real responsibility. She kept saying things like, "I didn't mean it that way, and I thought you knew I was playing and I never would have done it if I'd known you were actually upset." Her attorney had clearly coached her to apologize without admitting wrongdoing, but it came across as fake and self-serving. The mediator asked if everyone was willing to watch Bradley's video, and Denise's husband objected, saying they'd already seen it, but the mediator insisted. We all sat in uncomfortable silence watching the compilation of Denise hitting me 4 times in 1 hour at the anniversary party. Denise's face changed as she watched herself on screen, and she started crying, saying she didn't realize it looked that bad. She kept repeating, "I didn't know," while her husband tried to comfort her. Wallace would have jumped in to soothe her too, but he wasn't there, and Josephine sat quietly watching her daughter with a sad expression. The mediator firmly told Denise she needed to focus on accountability, not self-pity, because this session was about addressing harm she'd caused, not managing her feelings about being confronted. I pulled out my 4-page list and started reading it aloud, beginning with the wedding day assault. By page 2, Josephine was crying silently, and Wallace looked pale even though he wasn't present. Denise kept interrupting to say she didn't remember it being that many times, and I finally snapped at her that of course she didn't remember, because she wasn't the one living in constant fear of when the next hit would come. I told her I'd spent 3 years tensing up every time I heard footsteps behind me, and taking pain medication before family events and sleeping badly, because I'd have nightmares about being hit. Lucille let me speak without interruption, and I saw Denise's attorney taking notes, probably realizing how bad this looked for his client. The mediation lasted 3 hours with breaks where both sides went to separate rooms to discuss options. Finally, Denise came back into the room and offered what sounded like a genuine apology. She said she hurt me repeatedly over 3 years, and her behavior was abusive regardless of what she'd intended. She agreed to pay $15,000 to cover my medical expenses and damages. She agreed to attend anger management counseling for 6 months. She agreed to have no contact with me for at least 1 year while I healed. Her attorney drafted the settlement terms, and everyone except Wallace signed because he still refused to participate. I left the mediation feeling like I'd won something, but not everything. The financial compensation would cover my medical bills, and then some. The acknowledgement of harm was important after 3 years of being told I was too sensitive. But I knew Denise still didn't fully understand the severity of what she'd done to me. Lucille said this was typical in family abuse cases where abusers offer just enough accountability to avoid trial, but resist deeper examination of their behavior. She said I should be proud of what I'd accomplished because most family abuse victims never get any acknowledgement at all. Tom drove us home in silence, and I stared out the window thinking about how partial victories were sometimes all you could get when dealing with people who'd rather protect their self-image than face what they'd done. Wallace pushed back from the conference table so hard his chair scraped across the floor with a loud screech. He grabbed the settlement papers and threw them down without signing, then pointed at Lucille and said his daughter was railroaded by lawyers who wanted to make money off family drama. Josephine reached for his arm, but he pulled away and walked out of the mediation room, slamming the door behind him. The mediator asked if we needed a break, but Josephine shook her head and picked up the pen. She signed her name on every page where it required parental approval for Denise's agreement, her hand steady even though her eyes were red. After everyone except Wallace had signed, we packed up our documents and left through separate exits. I saw Josephine catch Tom in the parking lot and pull him aside for a private conversation. Through the car window, I watched her talking with her hands, gesturing toward the building, and Tom nodding with his arms crossed. Later that night, Tom told me his mother had said she knew Denise was wrong, even if Wallace couldn't admit it, and that she was sorry it took video evidence for her to believe me. 2 weeks later, Lucille called to say the settlement was finalized and the first payment would arrive within 5 business days. I sat at our kitchen table staring at the final agreement with all the signatures and official stamps, feeling strange about having a dollar amount attached to 3 years of abuse. The check for $5,000 came in the mail on a Thursday, and I deposited it through my phone, watching the numbers appear in my bank account. Over the next 6 months, the remaining $10,000 would come in monthly payments of about $1,600, which Denise's attorney said was structured that way to make it easier for her to pay. I didn't care how she paid as long as the money came through, because I had medical bills stacked on my desk and a chiropractor who'd been patient about my balance but needed payment. Tom and I sat down with a calendar and marked every family event for the next year, then went through and highlighted which ones included Denise. His brother's birthday party in May, his sister's graduation in June, Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. We decided we'd go to events where Denise wasn't invited, but skip anything that included her until I felt ready to be in the same space again. Some family members understood and started planning separate, smaller gatherings so we could attend. Tom's brother hosted a summer barbecue at his house and specifically didn't invite Denise, which caused Wallace to call Tom and accuse us of dividing the family. Tom's aunt sent a group text saying we were punishing everyone for Denise's mistakes, and that family meant forgiving and moving forward together. I blocked her number, and Tom sent one message back saying my healing wasn't up for family vote. The first thing I did with the settlement money was pay off the $4,000 emergency room bill that had been sitting in collections. Then I paid Tristan for the last 8 chiropractor visits I'd put on a payment plan. I scheduled an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Sarah Franco, who worked with trauma patients, and when I sat in her office for the first time, I cried, explaining how I felt relieved and angry and sad all at once. She said those feelings were normal after abuse, that my body and mind were processing 3 years of threat and harm, and that healing wasn't linear. We worked on addressing the constant tension I carried in my shoulders and neck, the way I still jumped when people walked behind me, the nightmares where I was back at family dinners anticipating the next hit. Dr. Franco taught me grounding techniques for when I felt panic rising and helped me work through the grief of losing the family relationships I'd hoped to have. Bradley started coming over for dinner every week, usually bringing takeout or cooking something simple in our kitchen. He never made a big deal about supporting me or acted like I owed him anything for recording that video. One night while we were cleaning up dishes, I asked him why he'd been recording Denise that night, and he dried his hands on a towel before answering. He said he'd been watching her behavior get worse over the past year, seeing how she'd time her hits for maximum impact and how she'd smile after doing it. He'd started documenting it on his phone at family events because he had a feeling something bad would happen eventually, and he wanted evidence in case I ever needed it. Turns out his instinct was right, and having that video compilation changed everything about how my case was treated. I hugged him and thanked him for seeing me when no one else in his family would, and he said that's what family should actually do. 6 months after the settlement, I went back to the neurologist for a follow-up appointment. My neck pain had decreased from daily agony to occasional stiffness, mostly when I slept wrong or sat at my computer too long. The migraines that used to hit 3 or 4 times a week were down to maybe twice a month, and they weren't as severe when they came. I could ride in cars without tensing up every time we stopped at a light. I could go to the grocery store without scanning every aisle to make sure no one was approaching from behind. The doctor said my progress was significant, but warned that some of the damage might be permanent, that I'd probably always have some sensitivity in my neck, and might deal with occasional headaches. I left her office feeling grateful for the improvement, even though I'd never be exactly the same as before Denise started hitting me. Tom kept his boundaries with his family, even when Wallace called every few weeks trying to guilt him into bringing me to events where Denise would be present. His sister sent long texts about how family forgiveness was important and how I was holding grudges. But Tom didn't respond or pass the messages along to me. We went to Leopold's office once a month for couples therapy, where we worked on rebuilding trust and addressing the resentment I still felt about his years of enabling. Tom admitted he'd been trained since childhood to protect Denise from consequences and keep family peace at any cost, and breaking those patterns was harder than he'd expected. But he was trying, making choices that prioritized our marriage over his parents' comfort, and I could see the difference in how he handled family pressure now compared to before. 8 months after the settlement, Denise's attorney sent a letter saying she'd completed her anger management program and wanted to know if I'd be willing to meet for a conversation. I read the letter twice, then put it in a drawer without responding. Tom asked if I wanted to consider it, and I said no. I wasn't ready, and might never be ready to sit across from her again. He nodded and called his parents that night to tell them my healing timeline wasn't up for negotiation, and they needed to stop asking when I'd forgive Denise. Wallace hung up on him, but Josephine stayed on the line and said she understood. Josephine and I had started rebuilding a relationship through careful steps and clear boundaries. She'd call once a month to check in, never pushing for information about the lawsuit or asking me to reconsider my stance on Denise. She'd invite us to lunch at restaurants, neutral territory where we could talk without family pressure. During one of these lunches, she admitted she'd failed as a mother-in-law by not protecting me, that she'd been so focused on keeping Wallace happy, and Denise's feelings managed, that she'd ignored my pain. She said she was working on holding Denise accountable even though Wallace refused to participate, and I could see the strain it put on their marriage. I appreciated her efforts and her genuine remorse, and slowly I started to trust that she meant what she said. A year after the settlement, I found a local advocacy group for family violence survivors and attended my first meeting. The room was full of people whose stories didn't match the typical abuse narrative, people hurt by parents and siblings and in-laws in ways that others dismissed as family drama. And I shared my story about the 3 years of being hit at family gatherings while everyone laughed and several people nodded in recognition. One woman said her brother-in-law had done something similar, disguising abuse as rough play, and no one believed her until he broke her arm. After the meeting, the group leader asked if I'd be willing to speak at other support groups about my experience, and I said yes. Sharing my story helped other people recognize abuse in their own families and validated that what happened to me was serious, even though it didn't fit the stereotypical pattern of intimate partner violence. Every time I spoke, I felt like I was transforming my pain into something useful, helping someone else find the courage to set boundaries or seek help. Tom's brother reached out 3 months after the settlement and asked if we wanted to come over for dinner, just the 4 of us without the rest of the family. His wife had been following everything from a distance and told him they needed to show us they were on our side, not sitting on the fence trying to keep everyone happy. That first dinner was awkward because we were all testing the waters, but by dessert, Tom's brother said he was done attending events where Denise was welcome. And his wife agreed they wanted to build a relationship with us that didn't depend on pretending the abuse never happened. Over the next few months, we started getting together regularly, and they became our closest family connection. When Thanksgiving approached, they asked if we wanted to celebrate at their house instead of going to Josephine and Wallace's traditional gathering. We said yes, and they invited Bradley and Sabine and a few other relatives who had supported us, creating this alternative family dinner where I didn't have to worry about being ambushed or lectured about forgiveness. Their kids asked why Aunt Denise wasn't there, and Tom's brother said because Aunt Lucy needs to feel safe at family events, which was the first time I'd heard someone explain it to children without making me sound like the problem. We started new traditions at their house, different foods and games and stories that didn't revolve around the way things had always been done. Having family members who completely supported us without expecting reconciliation gave us the connection we needed without the constant pressure to forgive and forget. The 1-year anniversary of the settlement arrived, and I had appointments scheduled with my whole medical team to evaluate my recovery progress. Tristan did his measurements and tests on my neck mobility, and said I'd regained about 80% of my range of motion, which was better than he'd expected given the severity of the cumulative damage. The neurologist ran me through cognitive tests and checked my migraine frequency logs, then said while I'd probably always be prone to headaches and might have some permanent nerve sensitivity, I'd regained most of my function and quality of life. She said the physical healing mirrored what she often saw in trauma recovery: scarred but functional, damaged but not destroyed. I left those appointments feeling grateful for how far I'd come, but also realistic about the permanent changes Denise's abuse had caused in my body. My neck would never be the same. I'd probably always tense up when someone walked behind me, but I could work and exercise and live without constant pain, which felt like winning even if it wasn't complete healing. A letter arrived at our house 2 weeks later with Denise's handwriting on the envelope, not sent through attorneys or her parents. I stared at it for 10 minutes before opening it, and inside was 3 pages of detailed apology, acknowledging specific incidents she remembered. She wrote about the wedding and my father's wake and the bathroom assault at the anniversary party, naming the harm she'd caused and the cumulative damage of making me afraid in my own family. She said she'd spent the year in therapy working on why she'd targeted me and understanding that her behavior was abuse regardless of her intentions. The letter didn't ask for forgiveness or suggest we should reconcile, just expressed genuine remorse and commitment to never behaving that way again with anyone. I read it twice and felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that she finally understood what she'd done. I showed it to Tom and he asked if I wanted to respond or meet with her, and I said no. I appreciated the letter, but I still wasn't ready for contact, and might never be. He nodded and said that was my choice to make, and he'd support whatever I decided. I put the letter in a folder with all the other documentation from the past year, evidence of the whole terrible journey and its painful resolution. Tom came home from work 3 months later and said his company was offering him a position in a different city, a promotion that would mean relocating about 4 hours away from his family. He asked what I thought, and I said I was excited about the fresh start and the healthy distance it would create. We'd still be close enough to visit Tom's brother and the supportive family members, but far enough that we wouldn't run into Denise at the grocery store or worry about awkward encounters at local events. We started planning the move, looking at houses and researching neighborhoods, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The experience had taught me that protecting yourself isn't selfish, that accountability matters more than family harmony, and that healing happens gradually through consistent boundaries and support from people who truly see you. Our family relationships would always be complicated and imperfect, but Tom and I had fought through this crisis together and come out stronger. I was proud of how we'd handled it, even though the damage couldn't be completely undone, and I was ready to build our life somewhere new, where the past didn't follow us into every room.